we were asked to read chapter 10, in a book called Electricity and Magnetism by Bleeny and Bleeny, an unlikely combination, a husband and wife team. And at the end of that chapter, there are 13 questions, all of them final honours questions. I discovered very rapidly that I couldn't do any of them. Richard and I worked together for the week, and we managed to do 1.5 questions, which we felt very proud of. Gordon refused all assistance and managed to do one all by himself. Stephen, as always, hadn't even started. But the next morning, he went up to his rooms at 9 o'clock. And we came back about 12, maybe 12:05. And down came Stephen, and we were in the college gateway in the lodge. "Ah, Hawking," I said, "how many have you managed to do then?" "Well," he said, "I've only had time to do the first 10. And I think at that point we realised that it's not just that we weren't in the same street, we weren't on the same planet.
I once calculated that I did about 1,000 hours work in the 3 years I was at Oxford, an average of an hour a day. I'm not proud of this lack of work. I'm just describing my attitude at the time. An attitude that nothing was worth making an effort for.
He used to produce his work every week for tutorial, and as he never kept any notes or papers or that sort of thing, on leaving my room he would normally throw it in my wastepaper basket. And when he was with other undergraduates at a tutorial and they saw this happen, they were absolutely horrified because they thought he did this work in probably half an hour. And if they could have done it in a year, they wouldn't have thrown it in the wastepaper basket, they would have put it in a frame up on their walls.
Because of my lack of work, I had planned to get through the final exam by doing problems in theoretical physics and avoiding any questions that required factual knowledge. I didn't do very well. I was on the borderline between a first and second class degree, and I had to be interviewed to determine which I should get. They asked me about my future plans. I replied, if they gave me a first, I would go to Cambridge. If I only got a second, I would stay in Oxford. They gave me a first.
I drove Stephen and his young brother out to Woburn Park, and he climbed a tree. He was testing himself out, I think. I didn't realise. And he did manage to climb a tree and to go along a branch of it and to get himself down. I think he began to notice that his hands were less useful than they had been, but he didn't tell us.
UNIV has these square staircases, which are round, but they're square. It was just coming down from one of the rooms. Steve actually fell on the stairs, coming down stairs, and kind of bounced all the way down to the bottom. I don't know if he lost consciousness, but he lost his memory. We took him to either my room or someone's room. The first question, of course, was, who am I? And we told him, you're Steve Hawking. And a minute later, or right away, he would ask again, who am I? Steve Hawking. And then after a couple of minutes, he remembered that he was Steve Hawking. Then we'd say, well, do you remember going down to the bar and having a drink on Sunday night? Or do you remember coxing on the river on Monday? And his memory came back gradually until he could remember the previous day's events and then the previous hour. And then by the end of the 2 hours, he could remember everything. The question was, well, maybe, you've lost some of your mind because of this. And so Steve decided, well, I'll take the Mensa test. We said, of course you'll get into Mensa. But he came back delighted that he was able to get into Mensa, absolutely delighted.
I felt that there were 2 areas of theoretical physics I might study at Cambridge. One was cosmology, the study of the very large. The other was elementary particles, the study of the very small. However, I thought that elementary particles were less attractive, because there was no proper theory. All they could do was arrange the particles in families, like in botany. In cosmology, on the other hand, there was a well-defined theory, Einstein's general theory of relativity.
It was a very cold year, and the ice on Verulamium Pond was frozen there, and we all went skating. And Stephen managed to skate fairly well, but then he and I were close together. He wasn't skating in a very advanced way, but nor was I, if it comes to that. He fell, and he couldn't get up. So I took him to a cafe to warm up, and he told me then all about it. And it was diagnosed. I insisted on going to see his doctor, because it seemed to me, however long you're going to live, there's probably something someone can do about it, at least anyhow, to make things easier for people. And I won't mention the doctor's name, but I got to see him at the London clinic. And he was rather surprised that I should bother to come round to see him. I mean, after all, I was only Stephen's mother. So he said he was quite nice. I mean, he agreed to see me in a rather grand way. And he said, yes, it's all very sad. I mean, brilliant young man, cut off in the prime of his youth, as it were. But of course, I said, well, what can we do? You see, well, what can we do to sort of, can we get physiotherapy? Can we get anything like that will help in any way? I said, well, actually, no. There's nothing to do with it, more or less. And that's it.
Shortly after my 21st birthday, I went into hospital for tests. They took a muscle sample from my arm, stuck electrodes into me, and injected some radio-opaque fluid into my spine, and watched it going up and down with X-rays as they tilted the bed. I was diagnosed as having ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or motor neuron disease, as it is also known. The doctors could offer no cure, and gave me 2.5 years to live.
I went into the graduates' common room and looking really for someone to have lunch with. And there was nobody around that I particularly wished to have lunch with. And then, lo and behold, Stephen walked through the door. I don't know what he was doing in Oxford either. I've certainly forgotten now. And so Stephen generously went off to buy the drinks and brought them over and put them down on the table. And as he put his pint of beer down, he spilt it. And I sort of said genially, oh, heavens, drinking at this time of day. And he then told me that he'd been in Addenbrooke's for 3 weeks, and they'd done a whole series of tests, and they'd decided what was wrong with him. And he told me very straight and flat that he was gradually going to lose the use of his body, that eventually only his heart and his lungs would still be operating, and his brain, and that they'd told him that eventually he would essentially have the body of a cabbage, but his mind would still be in perfect working order, and he would be unable to communicate with the rest of the world.
My dreams at that time were rather disturbed. Before my condition had been diagnosed, I had been very bored with life. There had not seemed to be anything worth doing. But shortly after I came out of hospital, I dreamt that I was going to be executed. I suddenly realized that there were a lot of worthwhile things I could do, if I were reprieved.
I knew perfectly well that he had no faith. And to me, that made it the more difficult, because you must ask yourself, why me? Why this? Why now? But he just totally, flatly accepted that this was what was going to happen to him. And as far as I can gather, at that point, he started to do some work.
At first, there did not seem much point in working at my research, because I didn't expect to live long enough to finish my PhD. However, as time went by, the disease seemed to slow down. I began to understand general relativity and make progress with my work. But what really made a difference was, I got engaged to a girl called Jane Wilde. This gave me something to live for, but it also meant that I had to get a job if we were to get married.
Stephen was already ill. Jane knew it. And it was another instance of Stephen's luck, you know, meeting the right person at the right time. Because Stephen was very, very badly depressed. And he wasn't really very much inclined to go on with his work. I mean, he'd been told he'd only got 2.5 years. What can you do in that time? But meeting Jane really put him on his mettle, and he started to work.
I wanted to understand how the universe began. Einstein's theory of general relativity showed that the universe was expanding. But there was no answer to the crucial question, must there have been a Big Bang, a beginning to time? Then, in my third year at Cambridge, Roger Penrose made his discovery about the death of stars.
I remember talking to this friend, Ivor Robinson, and we were having a sort of very animated conversation. And then we had to cross a road. And as we crossed the road, of course, the conversation stopped. And then we got to the other side. Well, evidently, I had some idea in crossing a road, but then the conversation started up, and it got completely blotted out of my mind. And it was only later, after my friend had gone home, I began to have this strange feeling of elation, feeling wonderful. And I couldn't figure out why on earth I should feel like that. So I went back over the day thinking all possible things which might have contributed to such a feeling. And then gradually I unearthed this thought which I'd had while crossing the street.
Penrose announced this result, that when stars collapse indefinitely, they will become singular, as long as some very broad conditions are satisfied that everybody would have regarded as reasonable. And I remember Stephen Hawking, who was then approaching his third year as a research student, saying, "What very interesting results. I wonder whether they could be adapted to understanding the origin of the universe." And what he had in mind, you see, was that if just mentally you reverse the sense of time, you can think of the expanding universe as a collapsing system. It's a bit like a giant, very giant star collapsing.
Roger Penrose proved that a dying star, collapsing under its own gravity, eventually shrinks to a singularity, a point of infinite density and zero size. I realized that if I reversed the direction of time so that the collapse became an expansion, I could prove that the universe had a beginning. But my proof, based on Einstein's theory of general relativity, also showed that we cannot understand how the universe began, because it showed that all scientific theories, including general relativity itself, break down at the beginning of the universe.
We had this meeting at the Institute of Space Physics in New York, I said before we reach a final conclusion, we ought to throw into the pot still another object, a gravitational